pedagogical reform in the title. And I'd like to ask whether a renewal process could take place without a structural reform. And I would like to examine the case of learning to think, which is something that we've been working with in the ministry for the past 3 years. Pedagogical and structural reforms often involve different circles of proponents, opponents, opportunities, and challenges. I think one of the benefits of structural reforms is that they facilitate radical change processes. But then sometimes it's precisely the extreme nature of the reform that generates opposition, which may obstruct the change process. And some examples to barriers to radical reforms is one is that they really may generate opposition. Second one is that they often require a large budget. And third is that they are often very complex and have a very wide scope. They go forward in big steps. And the nature of the big steps makes the implementation rather difficult. Another thing is that the change often focuses on structural reforms, while the necessary pedagogical support is neglected. And under such circumstances, what we may see is that the structural reform may be completed, but then the goal of the reform was not achieved. And one such example, I think we have many of them, but one such example is what we had here in the early 90s when we introduced computers into school. A lot of money was invested in buying the computers, in building very fancy rooms for them, which had a wonderful lock on them to prevent robbery, but then no support was given to the teacher about how to use them, and many of them are still in those lovely rooms where nobody enters, and they're what we called a white elephant. So I would like now to describe a process that we're now doing in the ministry. It's another horizon, but please don't confuse it with a new horizon. It's called pedagogical horizon. And I want to describe it and then sum up in asking the question, what is between structural and pedagogical reform? So in 2006, the Israeli Ministry of Education has embraced an educational policy whose goal is to move learning and instruction towards deep understanding and higher order thinking. We're talking about teaching thinking in all school subjects. The emphasis of the reform, and I just saw that I wrote reform here, but I should have written of the renewal process, is on pedagogy rather than on content, which means that we don't change the curriculum, we use the same curriculum, but we ask how can we teach it in a way that would center less on facts and transmission of information and more on deep thinking, analyzing, and asking questions, and so on. So we're centering on how to teach rather than on what to teach. We are going according to the infusion approach to teaching high order thinking, which means that thinking is integrated into the existing school curricula. So the main goal is pushing the system a little bit, and the question is, what is the delta, what is the magnitude of this? Is it a very little bit? Is it a considerable bit? But pushing the system from a pole in which today, unfortunately in our schools, a lot of learning and instruction since focuses on learning facts and carrying out algorithmic problem solving, towards teaching for understanding and higher order thinking, and of course this cannot go without the adoption of pedagogies of knowledge construction. The important thing here is that it's a pedagogical systemic goal. It's not the first time that teaching thinking is addressed in Israeli schools. We have many examples of this in the past. However, the novelty is in two things. One is that we're addressing it as a major and universal goal, and B, that we're trying to plan practical means for wide-scale implementation throughout the system. And in order to do this, we're working on three poles of a triangle. One is we do work on curriculum, standards, and learning materials. The second is, and this one, perhaps in terms of the budget and the investment, I think would be the largest one, is that we put a lot of energy into professional development on all levels. And the third is the assessment pole, because of course, even if we'll have a wonderful curriculum and we'll have great professional development courses, but the assessment will require facts, of course nothing will change. So we have to also work on the assessment, and we are doing small changes, which I will soon describe, both in the Meitzah, which is our national tests taken in 5th and 8th grade in the elementary school, and then the matriculation exams, which are the exit exams at the end of high school. The implementation has two main exercises. One is school-based programs, which I will not describe today, and the other one is an axis that works through school subjects. And here the main vectors of the process are what we call subjects chief supervisors, or SCS. Each subject in Israel has a subject supervisor who is responsible for everything that happens in this subject, from policy regarding the curriculum. Although they don't write the curriculum, there is a different division for this, but they together with the group of people, decide what is the policy for the curriculum of this subject. They're responsible for how teaching and learning in this subject goes on in the schools, and they're also involved and have heavy responsibility in the assessment of the subjects. So one of the ways to carry out this implementation process was through a process of professional development and empowerment of subjects chief supervisors. What we did was that we initiated a workshop that was initially supposed to be for 1 year. At the end of this year, people were asking for more, so we continued it for another year, and now in about 2 weeks, we have the last meeting of the third that will conclude the 3-year process, in which 25 people from 25 different subjects. Some of them are the major subjects in our system, like the sciences, history, civics, the various sciences, the Bible, and other subjects. I will not count them all, but it's important to understand that there are the major subjects in the curriculum. Actually went through a very intense professional development process that centered on pedagogy. The first year was more a learning type of course. Then, from the second year on, since people started to implement things in their own work, the nature changed. It became more kind of a collaborative process in which people brought in their share of the work, and people were giving feedback to each other, and so on. So what was the nature of this process? In 25 different subjects, there was one very clear goal presented to everybody, the goal that we showed before, the move from rote learning to understanding and teaching. So there is one clear goal. People were given or were in an atmosphere that helped them develop professional pedagogical tools to implement this goal. People were given resources, but people were also given a lot of autonomy. And I think one of the important things here is to understand that all those people were actually responsible for creating their own ways in their own subjects. And I think this is very important, because the circumstances in each of these subjects is very different. In some subjects, they teach from kindergarten to 12th grade. Some subjects are electives, others are mandatory. As a result of this, the population of the students differs. The population of the teachers differs. The problems are different. So I think what's interesting, I think, in this process, there is one very clear goal, but then a lot of autonomy, and the way things developed is really depending on the context, on the very specific content that takes place in each of the disciplines. So what happened in all these disciplines? There is a professional development for the SCS, then there was a professional development of lecturers and instructors. Instructors are something that we have of people who go into the schools and support teachers in their learning and teaching and learning processes. Then from them we had professional development of teachers, there was preparation of learning materials, and changes in assessment. And as an example, I could have talked about each of the poles of the triangle, but as an example, I would like to talk about assessment and focus on the matriculation exam. And I'd like to say the following. The Israeli matriculation exams are extremely conservative, and in general, they did not change in many, many years. They assess mainly knowledge of facts and the ability to solve routine problems, and they require only very little higher order thinking. This is not true for some of our electives, which developed in recent years, inquiry projects and stuff like that, but for the main part of the mandatory courses, I think this is absolutely, unfortunately, it's absolutely true. Since, as we all know, assessment drives instruction, and since teachers teach for the test, the current matriculation exams are therefore a barrier to any pedagogical change we would like to introduce. And therefore, in order to implement the pedagogical horizon, it was really crucial to try and introduce some changes in this system. Now, what is the history of school reform concerning reforming the matriculation exams? It's not the first time that we're trying. In the last almost 20 years, there were at least 3 policy documents, very elaborate ones, that dealt with this issue. The direction that they all go in is the same direction. We need to have more thinking, more inquiry, more project-based learning and assessment, more portfolios as part of the assessment. But, and also many of them said that we need to reduce the number of mandatory subjects, because when we cover so much, we can only teach each subject in a very limited depth. However, these 3 documents were not really successful. They described they used revolutionary kinds of goals. Just for the sake of the Israelis in the audience, I'd like to say that I'm referring to Doch Ben Peretz from 1992. I'm referring to Chozer Kaf that dealt with this issue, and also, of course, to Doch Dovrat that has a chapter on the matriculation exams. And what we thought we may try to do, or before this, I just want to bring 2 types of barriers of what actually blocked the movement from the policy document to implementation in the previous years. One was that the structural changes that were implied in these documents, for instance, the reduction in number of tests actually triggered a lot of opposition from various and sometimes really unexpected interest groups in the Israeli society. One of them, which may not have been unexpected, was the teachers' union. The other one was, and I'm talking here about the high school teachers' union, another one which you would really not expect was the Israeli Writers' Association. Now, why would they object? Because if the literature exam will not be mandatory, then they were afraid that literature teachers, who many of them belong to this association, will be made redundant. Okay, so this is just one small example to show you the types of opposition that such a process actually generates. Another thing which I think, another example which I would like to bring here is that to say that radical changes in assessment really also, of course, require dramatic changes in learning, instruction, and assessment. And making such radical changes is very, very difficult. So we had a small pilot project called Matriculation 2000 to try and see how it works. There was an assessment of this project which showed that it worked rather well. However, this project, because it was so complete and because it was so deep, was never able to upscale because it required a lot of financial investment. It was very expensive. It put a lot of extra load on the teachers. And in general, it was another very beautiful pilot project which never managed to upscale. So what is different in what we're trying to do today? And I want to say that I completely agree with all the radical recommendations of the three previous policy documents. Okay, and I wish we could do that. But if we can't do the 100%, and I don't think that any of the reasons that prevented this progress 15 or 10 years ago disappeared today, then what we try to do is to move forward in small steps and saying if we can't make a revolution, let's begin an evolutionary process. So we're talking about three families of changes. One is in written tests, where very slowly, with an emphasis on the very slowly increasing the percentage of higher order thinking items in the written exams. Two is that we're gradually adding small inquiry projects, again with an emphasis on small, which will be part of the final matriculation score. And for instance, now mandatory since next year will be a 20% part of the civics matriculation exams, which will be an inquiry kind of project, and this is going to be implemented nationwide. So it's only 20%. It's not a complete revolution. On the other hand, because it's only 20%, it makes it much more practical to implement it. It's less frightening to the teachers. It's less expensive. Also, I think in assessment we really have many goals, and I think some of the goals should remain being assessed by written tests. Another thing is that we're increasing the component of school-based portfolio assessment, but once again as part of the final matriculation score, and we have here three examples. It's happening meanwhile as pilot projects in science, literature, and English. And once again, the changes are gradual. They're very, very slow. We're going in very slow steps, and they are accompanied by extensive professional development and of appropriate learning materials. So this was the description. If I'm now trying to analyze this process according to the major questions that I raised at the beginning, I want to ask what is the features of this implementation process. So first of all, it's pedagogical rather than structural, okay? And we're using mainly pre-existing structures, both in terms of the administration. For instance, the subject chief supervisors, the ones who anyway lead what's going on in the different subjects. The instructors are anyway there. We anyway have professional development courses. We just gave them a switch in terms of their content. But also in terms of the structure of the matriculation exams, we didn't try yet to change the external structure of the exams. What we're doing are internal changes. Second thing I already said, it's evolutionary rather than revolutionary process. We have very little opposition because of this. And part of it's part of a much more comprehensive change. It's also professional development curriculum, not only assessment. But it's small. However, change in fact is taking place, okay? It's small, but I think it could be significant, because if we add all the three types of changes, and even if each subject only changes a little bit, it gives an opportunity for a different type of instruction to take place in the classrooms, at least for large chunks of the time teachers and students interact. The big question, I said already that it's small, but I think it's significant. The question, of course, is the longevity of this whole process. On the one hand, trying to be optimistic, I'm telling myself that in Hebrew we say hafuch al hafuch. The heaviness and the resistance of the system to change makes it such that if you already introduced changes into the way the matriculation exams are built, it would now needs a lot of energy to switch it back. However, as we know, we are on the verge, not on the verge, we are in the process of another changing government, minister, and everything. And the big question is what would be the longevity of this process. So this is, I think, what I can say about a pedagogical rather than structural reform. What are the disadvantages? One big disadvantage is that it doesn't take us all the way. Okay, if I'm looking at the policy document, for instance, of the Doch Ben Peretz from the 1992, I think that in order to achieve the full force or the full significance of what this report said that needed to be changed in matriculation exams in order to support the change that we want in teaching and learning, we need to go further. And this does not take us all the way. However, it's a first step, I think, in the right direction. So I think that consolidation and enhancement of the change will require structural changes. It's an example I want to say again, the reducing of the number of mandatory tests and compensation for teachers for adding maybe extra components to the testing and teaching. So to summarize, what I'd like to say is that I think what we see here is that professional development and especially empowerment of key people within the system can be effective in bringing about considerable pedagogical renewal. But please pay attention, I'm very cautious and I'm using the word pedagogical renewal rather than reform. I think it can make significant change, and we're hearing this from all over the country that it actually, it's happening. However, this is part of the way, and structural change is still needed to consolidate and elaborate the process. And I think that in this tension between structural and pedagogical, it's interesting to see what will happen in the next several years with this process. Thank you.
Professor from Michigan State.
Let's get rid of this over here. And where is your PowerPoint presentation? And let me make it big so we can see what we're doing.
Good afternoon. My name is Don Purock. I'm an assistant professor in the College of Education at Michigan State University. Today I'll be talking to you about work that I've done on the topic of building educational infrastructure to support large-scale school improvement. And I think it's very important to point out from the beginning that you're going to see a very interesting contrast with the preceding talk. And as you listen to my talk and as you think about the preceding talk, I think it's important not to think of these as mutually exclusive approaches to improving schools. But more importantly, I think it's interesting to think about these as alternative approaches to improving different types of schools that are currently at different levels of performance. So it's important not to dichotomize these, but to begin to develop a nuanced sense of what might be done to develop these types of pedagogical practices in schools. The first part of the talk is a conceptual overview in which I'll explain the policy context and problem that motivates this work, the implementation challenge that follows from that policy problem, which is this need to build educational infrastructure, and then a driving question that follows from this implementation challenge. That is a question about the role of external agencies in collaborating with schools to address the challenge of building educational infrastructure. The second part of the talk is my report of a case study that I conducted of an organization that does exactly this type of work. In the second part of the talk, I'll explain our case selection, our findings in which we detail what we call a replication strategy for building educational infrastructure. And I'll conclude by drawing from the case to frame a set of key conjectures about this problem of building educational infrastructure. So the policy problem. In the United States and in many of the countries represented at this conference, one policy problem is particularly pressing, and that is the need to improve chronically underperforming schools, especially those serving large populations of students at risk of academic failure. In the U.S., there's political pressure for rapid improvement. These schools are being held accountable for demonstrating annual gains in student achievement towards state and national educational goals. This improvement needs to happen at a very large scale. In 2007-2008 in the United States, Education Week reported that nearly 18% of U.S. schools failed to demonstrate policy-specified achievement gains for 2 consecutive years. That's nearly 15,000 schools. This improvement also needs to be sustainable. Success for 1 year isn't enough. Schools need to be able to institutionalize improvements and sustain achievement gains over time. In our analysis, a fundamental challenge faced by school-level implementers lies in the work of building educational infrastructure to support rapid, large-scale, sustainable improvement. Now, by educational infrastructure, we mean systems of coordinated resources that support both high-quality leadership instruction and student achievement, and school-based efforts to improve leadership instruction and student achievement. And we think about this educational infrastructure on 2 levels. Drawing from what we talked about yesterday as the effective schools literature, school-level infrastructure includes such elements as coherent instructional programs that coordinate instructional designs, curriculum, and professional development, formal structures that support academic and professional learning, including time for learning, space to meet, knowledge resources on site, information systems providing data, and social norms and structures that support academic and professional learning. For example, a culture of trust, responsibility, improvement, and openness. Drawing from theories of systemic reform, we think of a complement to school-level infrastructure as system-level infrastructure. And this includes such elements as coordinated state-level curriculum frameworks, performance standards, and accountability assessments, as well as professional education, basic and applied research, commercial curricula, diagnostic assessments, and other resources that are coordinated with these state-level policy instruments. Now, in the U.S., one problem is that historically, the educational infrastructure in and around chronically underperforming schools has been both weakly developed and weakly coordinated. Many essential elements are either missing or they're functioning at a very low level. Further, collectively, the elements don't interact in positively and mutually reinforcing ways to support either high levels of practice or the ongoing improvement of practice. From that follows an important driving question. The result of weak educational infrastructure is exactly the sort of policy implementation gap around which this entire conference is organized. And that school leaders are being held accountable for rapid, large-scale, sustainable improvement absent the essential educational infrastructure to do just that. So given that reality for these schools, the question becomes, assuming that schools operate in an environment of standards and accountability, what strategies can governmental and non-governmental agencies pursue to support school leaders in designing and leveraging educational infrastructure? What specific forms of assistance can they provide, and in what ways, if any, is their assistance responsive to pressure for rapid, large-scale, sustainable improvement in, importantly, chronically underperforming schools. So, to begin exploring these questions, I want to tell you about a case study of one organization that works with the leaders of chronically underperforming schools to design and to build and to leverage educational infrastructure. The study focused on the Success for All Foundation. This is a leading non-governmental provider of improvement services to U.S. schools and districts. I'll call it SFAF. SFAF is an independent nonprofit foundation of over 200 people that's been in operation for over 20 years. It sponsors several different types of programs, but the one on which I'll focus today is its cornerstone program, which is called simply Success for All. In the United States, Success for All is known as a comprehensive school reform program. In contrast to narrow, targeted interventions, comprehensive school reform programs target chronically underperforming schools with coordinated, multi-component interventions. Though it's comprehensive, the focus of the program is actually narrow. The focus is kindergarten through grade 6 reading with the goal of on-grade level reading performance for all students at the end of each grade. The study was conducted within the Study of Instructional Improvement at the University of Michigan. This was a longitudinal mixed method study that compared the design, implementation, and effects of 3 leading comprehensive school reform programs: Success for All, a program called America's Choice, and a program called the Accelerated Schools Project. For this particular case study, I collected data over a 12-year period from 1996 to 2008. This included document reviews, interviews with program staff, people in schools, participant observation, and training events. And our analysis ran concurrent with data collection, such that we were constantly conducting ongoing comparison across programs of their designs, of their implementation, and of their effects. And we constantly, over this period, reviewed our analyses with the people we were studying to validate them. So let me summarize our findings. In terms of strategies, in the U.S., a conventional approach, and an approach used by many of the people described at this conference, is an approach to building educational infrastructure that we call a site-based strategy. Now, in this strategy, school leaders hold primary responsibility for designing and building educational infrastructure, both by building new systems of resources within their schools and by reconfiguring their relationships with their environments to support school-based improvement efforts. By contrast, the strategy pursued by SFAF is what we call a replication strategy. In this strategy, SFAF assumes primary responsibility for designing educational infrastructure both at the school and at the system level. SFAF then collaborates with school leaders to replicate and to use this infrastructure across large numbers of chronically underperforming schools. Now, in the U.S., you see replication strategies used by several categories of external agencies. Comprehensive school reform providers, like Success for All. Charter management organizations. You may have heard of the Knowledge is Power program in the U.S. It's a charter school program called KIPP. And educational management organizations. You may have heard of the Edison Project. Beyond education, replication strategies are used widely in franchise-like arrangements in which a hub organization designs a core organizational model and then replicates that organizational model across a large number of outlets. Now, this is used for everything from fast food to the replication of such professional organizations as specialized clinics. In terms of forms of assistance, this site-based strategy relies on what we describe as distributed assistance. In this scheme, multiple governmental and non-governmental organizations provide resources and incentives that motivate, support, and guide the school-level infrastructure and design work of school leaders. Now, this includes guidance and tools for analyzing the existing organization of the school, guidance and examples to support the work of redesigning and restructuring the school, component technologies and services, textbooks, assessments, information systems, professional development that leaders can integrate into a coherent system, and importantly, funding to drive this. With SFAF's replication strategy, we see what we described as centralized assistance. SFAF functions as a single source provider that assumes responsibility for designing comprehensive, coordinated educational infrastructure at the school and at the system level. And then it provides coordinated implementation assistance in the form of opportunities for leaders and teachers and even students to learn to use this new infrastructure to support and improve their day-to-day work. Now, regarding design assistance, over 20 years, Success for All's educational infrastructure has expanded to include coordinated resources at the school and at the system level. At the school level, Success for All began with a common school-wide design for K-6 reading instruction that features cooperative learning for students and diagnostic instruction by teachers. That is, teachers continuously monitoring students' use of reading skills and strategies and immediately responding to problems in the context of regular classroom instruction. From there, SFAF extended this educational infrastructure to support that specific design for classroom instruction. At the school level, this includes formal structures, for example, a school-wide K-6 reading curriculum coordinated specifically with that instructional design, a 90-minute reading block in common across the whole school for reading instruction, quarterly assessment and class-level regrouping of students that enables the placement of students at their current reading mastery level in this curriculum, school-wide classroom management, social problem solving, and attendance programs, and supplemental tutoring, other academic assistance, and other non-academic assistance for the most struggling students. It includes social structures, for example, the articulation of clear program goals and principles, and the articulation of a common vocabulary of instructional and leadership practice. It includes designs for linking schools to parents, community resources, and districts. And it includes designs for developing school leaders as on-site change agents responsible for the ongoing evaluation, coordination, and improvement of the program. At the system level, Success for All has created a professional network of over 1,200 schools all using this same school-level infrastructure. And that they're using the same school-level design, these schools provide mutual support and they collaborate with SFAF in the ongoing improvement of the program. The organization itself, SFAF, functions as the hub of this professional network with centralized capabilities for design, training, research, and evaluation. Now, as the hub, SFAF also functions as the interface between this professional network and activity in the broader system of U.S. public education, including ongoing changes in policy requirements, standards and accountability assessments, in funding opportunities, in research, and more. And it functions to mediate between all of that activity and the schools that are a member of its network. SFAF matches this comprehensive design assistance with equally comprehensive assistance with implementation. So the goal is not simply to replicate organizational structures and resources across schools. The goal is to replicate the capabilities of school leaders, teachers, and students to use these resources effectively and to continuously improve. So towards this goal, SFAF elaborates intended practice. That is, it provides materials, technologies, and other sources that give specific directions to leaders, teachers, and students in the use of program-provided resources in their day-to-day work. SFAF also scaffolds intended practice. That is, it provides school leaders and teachers with learning opportunities that are intentionally designed to support the use of these program resources to enact very new roles and very new responsibilities. This is weighted heavily towards developing school leaders' capabilities to coordinate, motivate, and continue to drive school-level improvement. Now, this combination of elaboration and scaffolding is structured developmentally to transition chronically underperforming schools from novice beginning use of the program to more expert use of the program. Novice initial use over the first year of implementation focuses largely on consistent, faithful implementation of the program as written. In years 2 and 3 of implementation, the transition is to developing capabilities within schools to use program resources adaptively and responsively to meet the needs of their students, teachers, and community. Now, in terms of responsiveness to policy imperative, this combination of franchise-like centralized design and implementation assistance is intended to increase the possibility of weak schools responding to policy pressure for rapid, large-scale, sustainable improvement. In terms of rapid improvement, the program is designed to enable schools to begin school-wide implementation on day 1 of year 1 as a Success for All school. Deliberate attempts to anchor the program in research-proven strategies and to refine the program based on 20 years of experience is intended to increase the probability of quick success on some basic level. Key features of the program are intended to support large-scale operations, including achieving economies of scale by centralizing design activity, using inexpensive and easily reproduced materials to provide specific guidance for practice, developing school leaders as on-site change agents, and leveraging the professional network to provide peer-to-peer assistance among schools, thus relieving training responsibilities on SFAF itself. So using these resources, Success for All is currently in use in over 1,200 U.S. elementary schools. And for sake of comparison, that's more elementary schools than supported by all but 12 state education agencies. In comparison to our colleague from Estonia this morning, this is almost double the number of schools in Estonia. Finally, key features of Success for All are intended to promote sustained success, including 3 years of direct support from the organization itself, the development of school leaders as on-site change agents, the option to continue participating in the professional network indefinitely, and SFAF, the organization, its long-term viability as the hub of this organization, of this enterprise. So as it stands, SFAF and Success for All have been in existence for over 20 years, and the average time in program currently for schools is over 8 years. So to wrap up, just a few key points. More than anything, what I mean for this to do is to demonstrate, to use SAF as a sort of existence proof to demonstrate the possibility of pursuing a replication strategy as an alternative to the conventional site-based approach to developing and using educational infrastructure, especially for chronically weak schools that are often overwhelmed by that type of design responsibility. Besides establishing evidence of rapid, large-scale, and sustainable improvement, in our study, we saw positive effects of the program in improving leadership practice, instructional practice, and student achievement. That said, pursuing this type of strategy hinges on some very important enabling conditions. One very important one is voluntary participation by schools in an intensive and very deep-reaching long-term improvement process. Developing understanding within schools that highly specified external programs and site-based discretion are not mutually exclusive approaches to improvement. And it depends very heavily on the existence of an organization like SFAF with very uncommon capabilities for coordinated program development, training, research, evaluation, and ongoing program improvement. Very importantly, too, the magnitude of the program provides perspective on the conventional site-based strategy. And this is the type of design work that's being thrust upon leaders in chronically underperforming schools, often without external assistance. It's a pretty big task. This gives you some perspective. So bottom line, if we expect rapid, large-scale improvement in weak schools, our argument is that we need to address the problem of weak infrastructure. In doing so, there's an advantage in moving beyond thinking exclusively about site-based solutions to considering something like a replication strategy for generating, replicating, and using the infrastructure needed for improvement. Thank you.
Dr. David Portas, akong vice ng Canada.
Well, there's some good news and bad news. The good news is this is the last talk for today. The bad news is that, unfortunately, I didn't see the guidelines for lecturers either until too late in some of my lectures in English and not in Hebrew, although it could and should have been in Hebrew. So I apologize for that. What you're going to hear now is really nothing new. This is the description of a case study that we did here of a reform attempt done in Israel in science education. And the findings are going to pretty much fit with what you've seen and heard during the day. So don't expect big surprises. I'd like to thank Tommy Levy-Nahum and Ronnie Moalim, my colleagues who helped me do this work. Okay, what was Tomorrow 98? It was a large-scale national project that was run during the 90s. It started from an initiative by Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and who's then the Minister of Education, Zvulun Hammer, who basically recognized the need to reform science education in Israel. And they approached Professor Harari, who was at that time the president of the Weizmann Institute, which is the very institute where I work, and asked him to organize a committee and to come and to set forth recommendations on how the system can be changed to improve science and technology and math education in Israel. Now, why science and math? Israel is a country that's poor in natural resources, and really the only natural resource we have, other than a bit of potash in the Dead Sea, is people. Okay, and so it was clear to them that in order to ensure Israel's economic and economics, not only economic security, but also our physical security, it was very dependent upon people having strong math, science, and technology backgrounds, which today is Israel's forte. It was a K-12 reform program, and hundreds of millions of dollars were allocated to the program, which is a lot in Israel's measures, anywhere else it is, but for Israel it's quite a bit. The project was really large scale. Just about everybody who could possibly be involved in it was involved in some way or another. So we saw basically three circles of participants. First of all was the Ministry of Education. There was a project team set up inside the ministry itself, okay, and there were the heads of the various divisions inside the ministry. From the field, we had the municipalities that were involved. We had principals, we had teachers, the students, of course. That's what it's all about, basically. Academy was involved as curriculum developers and as professional development providers. And also non-profit organizations were involved. They're not the balancing point, but I had no other place to put them rather than down the middle. Okay. Now, the report was divided into 4 sections. And there were altogether 43 recommendations in the report that came out. I'm going to focus only on those that dealt with middle school science education. Okay? So there's a lot of other stuff going on behind here that I'm not going to mention at all today. I'm focusing. Why did I choose science and science, middle school science and technology education? That's the field that I deal with. And secondly, the largest changes occurred in this area. They basically invented a completely new topic, which wasn't in existence beforehand. So major changes occurred in the area of middle school science and technology, and that's one of the reasons we decided to focus on it. So you'll see that some rectangles are colored purple. Those are the recommendations that dealt with middle school science and technology, and those are the ones I'm going to speak about. So briefly, what were the recommendations? First of all, there was the need to create a new topic called science and technology in middle schools, developing new curriculum for it, new standards, and so on. There was a recommendation for bringing computers into schools. This was the beginning of the 90s, 92, and computers were not widespread yet in the Israeli educational system. This was not the first time that computers had been mentioned, okay, discussed the need to introduce them in the school system, but this was a very large focus of this report, the need to introduce computers into schools. And there were also some organizational issues, recommendations that the committee dealt with. First is the project management itself, how the project should run, the budget that they felt the project needed to succeed, the issues around curriculum development, and regional support centers, which have to do with professional development of teachers. And so these are the issues I'm going to talk about. Now, the data sources we had for making this inquiry were from 3 main sources. First of all, reports generated by the project itself. Second, interviews. We interviewed many people, okay? And as you can see at the bottom, we tried to interview people at all levels of the educational system, from members of the Harari Committee, including Professor Harari himself, an oversight committee that was set up to follow up how well things were going, okay? People who were involved in the project management, division heads in the Ministry of Education, professional inspectors, I forget exactly the acronym you used, directors of these regional PD centers, school principals, teachers, researchers who have done work on this, okay, and curriculum developers. So we try to cover as much as possible everybody involved. We also make use of documents that were generated by committees at the Knesset and other research reports that have been generated along the line by all kinds of organizations. So, what is the residue? In other words, what do we see today that is left over, okay, that began back over then? First, other than in the Ort schools, which are professional school system in Israel, other than the Ort schools, arts, craft, and technology have pretty much disappeared from middle schools. Okay? Now, I'm sure there are exceptions to this fact, okay, but if you randomly walk into any middle school in Israel, art is no longer taught there, for instance. Okay? Neither is craft. Technology is supposedly taught there as part of this new program called Science and Technology, but in practice, it's not taught. It's all science. So that's something that's disappeared because of this project. Something that has appeared are computers. Computers are found in just about every Israeli school, and they're, for better or for worse, depending upon how they're used, okay, they are a main part of the educational experience that students have in middle school. Okay, a new subject was created with a new syllabus. One of the big changes we saw were that the teachers now use the curriculum as guides rather than as doctrine. Before, teachers taught the textbook. Now they have a topic they have to teach, and they view textbooks as guides. And that is part of the professional development program that started with this program. Okay? What this had, a side effect of this is that many official textbooks aren't used at all. In other words, books that were developed as part of the project, okay, are no longer being used. Teachers don't feel they satisfy the needs of their students, okay, and as we said, we don't teach textbook any longer, okay, they're only guides, so we're responsible for giving our children the best possible educational experience, so very often these books are not used. Finally, the curriculum was designed for 6 weekly hours of instruction throughout middle school. Most schools in Israel provide their students only with 2 to 3 hours, weekly hours of science and technology. The curriculum hasn't changed. Okay, so we have half or a third amount of time needed, okay, to complete the job. Professional development. A big change that has found its way into our common consciousness, okay? And although it's there, I don't see it yet being put into practice, but it's a big change, is that we all realize that teachers are the agents of change. And we've heard that many times today, okay? We cannot ignore the teachers. We cannot make decisions, expect teachers to carry things out. Okay? Teachers are at the center, and no matter what we do, we have to think about how are teachers going to carry this out. What kind of supports do teachers need to do this properly? If the teachers are not part of our game plan, positively, okay, nothing's going to happen. Secondly, professional development today is minimalistic. Most teachers go years without ever getting any professional development, and when it's done, its quality is quite variable. And it's usually done using pre-project models. One of the things the project did was develop new models of how professional development should be done. Okay? After the project died, okay, these models pretty much died with them, and we've gone back to where we were before the project. On a good point, almost all the teachers we spoke with spoke of the project as the high point in their career. Okay? Well, it's good or bad, because that means we're no longer in the high point, but still there was a sense that something good was happening. I think that's important for future reform efforts. Okay? That there is this ability to bring new energies into the system, and teachers feel that there actually something is happening good. Okay, school initiatives. The management of the project decided not only to work top down, but bottom up. So basically, schools, teachers, districts were allowed to develop plans for things they would like to change independently and to apply for money from the ministry to do that. Okay? And they were called school-based initiatives. And the phrase that was used over and over was that 1,000 flowers shall bloom. Okay, we're going to throw lots of money. These are not small sums of money. One of the requirements was that these initiatives would be large scale. They wouldn't be small things. Okay? And we're going to give teachers this money, and we're going to create ground level energies, and things are going to happen. Okay? The problem is, gardens tend to die after a year if you don't keep on taking care of them. Okay? They need to be watered, they need to be weeded, they need to be reseeded. Okay? And today, okay, they apparently, I can't say it for certain, they apparently had a positive impact on teacher motivation. But if you ask me where today is there one of those initiatives that's still around, I can't tell you. That's why I say little. I'm not saying there's none. I couldn't find any. Okay, the high-stakes test that was mentioned before, the Meitzov exam. It was not specified by the Harari Committee, but it was born in the latter stages of the project in an attempt to empower inspectors. The idea was that inspectors needed more information about what was actually happening in their fields, in their schools, and so on, to make good decisions about how to support them. So the idea here is this is a feedback tool that will help inspectors make better decisions. Okay? Today, it's morphed into a high-stakes test. It's become the whip of the educational system. Teachers are in fear of it. Principals are in fear of it, okay? Schools are rated according to it. This is not the intention of the test at all. So professionally we say it suffers from poor consequential validity. In other words, the design of the test is good, okay? But the way it's being used is not as good. So, to summarize the residue, okay, before we go into why we have this residue, okay, if I look at the list of recommendations from the Harari report, not much. Okay? Not very much. However, when you say measure how much is left or not, it depends upon the lens you're using. Okay? I use the Harari report as the standard that guided us in what to look for. That doesn't mean that the project didn't lead to many other things, good things, that may be around today that weren't specified by the project, and for that reason, we don't know that they actually were born as a result of the project. So an example of that is the pedagogical horizon of Professor Zohar. Okay, during the project, Professor Zohar received funds from the Ministry of Education to work on a project that basically led to the pedagogical horizon project today. So I would have never known that hadn't not spoken to me and explained this to me, okay? So when I say there's not very much, I have to qualify that. There's not very much. Using the Harari report as the standard against which things are measured, there may be many other things that we're not aware of. Another thing that is remaining of the project, and I want to quote here, is Dr. Shoshani here? No, okay. This was said by Dr. Shoshani, who was the Director General of the Ministry at the time the project began, and he's today, once again, Director General. This is a quote. If we hadn't done what we did then, the educational system would have collapsed. It was in very bad shape, not catastrophic like today, but still very bad. He said this in Hebrew, I translated. Okay? So maybe the fact that we're still around, that we're still here for 10 years later and things are still limping along, is something that can be attributed to the project. Now, why? First of all, let's look at the report itself. How much more time do I have? Okay, I'll speed up. The report itself is really, it's a well-written report. It's coherent, it's clear, level. Okay? Big problem, in my opinion, is that they recommended a 5-year project rather than a 10-year project. Now, the report does talk about continuation after 10 years. And if you'll see, when we look at the budget, they actually specified how much money is needed after the 5 years to continue it. But the very name, Tomorrow 98, when it began in 93, means it's a 5-year project. And you're basically giving someone the key to lock the door in 5 years' time. Okay? So I think that was a mistake. Second mistake was combining the hours of science and technology. Beforehand, science was taught separately, technology was taught separately. This has a certain number of hours allocated to it, that has a certain number of hours. They wanted 6 hours, so they said, let's put them together. Together we have 6 hours. But then, when budget cuts arrive, it's very easy to cut from a 6-hour topic. Okay, no, let's take off 2 hours of it. It still has 4 hours, it's only 30%. Taking the same number of hours off a subject that has only 2 hours or 3 hours allocated to it is much more difficult. So by the fact of combining hours together, okay, once again, they set themselves up for future cuts. Okay, the nature of technology and its relation to science was left vague and open to interpretation. They only say technology, but nowhere do they specify what they mean by technology. And this is widely interpreted by different people. There were principals, okay, who thought that using technology was meant using computers. Okay, we're doing technology, we have computers. That was it. Okay? So the relationship, definition of technology and its relationship with science was something that was left open. And finally, there is no mention of assessment and the need to change assessment to match the new goals of the report. Okay, now, looking at reasons why things may have developed they did. In 16 years, we've had 12 ministers of education. Okay? They come and go. So, no need to elaborate on that one. Okay? On the other hand, education has high inertia. Education is very often to change because it involves so many stakeholders, different stakeholders with different agendas, and so on. So, you know, because ministers tend to know, I'm not going to last here very long, I want something that will show quick results, you know, something that will be my legacy. Okay? And anything in education, my personal opinion, anything that is designed for less than 10 years, forget about it. It's not going to happen. It doesn't have time enough to entrench itself inside the system and to build the capacity to live on its own without continuous support by the outside. Secondly, the Ministry of Education has no long-term consensus-based agenda. If you can ask people in the ministry, what are the goals 10 years, in 20 years, what was the nature, we heard today exactly what is the type of student we want to raise and so on. There is no long-term agenda, okay? And if there was something that, even though ministers changed, as we heard today this morning's talk by David Bell, okay, it could serve as a background on which things happen, which is exactly how he described it. We don't have that background right now in the Israeli education system. On the other hand, while there's very large turnover at the very top, there's very small turnover at the mid-level inside the ministry. People who were mid-level managers in the ministry 16 years ago still are there, often holding exactly the same position. Okay? So, too much turnover is not good. Okay? Some turnover is sometimes a good idea. Okay. Another quotation, directly, I just liked it, was that the Ministry of Education is not a learning organization. We're not only talking about improving the entire educational system, we're talking about improving how the ministry itself runs projects. So, for example, this inquiry that I'm describing now was funded by a non-profit organization. Why didn't the ministry fund something like this? Why is there not a culture of finding out what are we doing right, what are we doing wrong? How can we improve ourselves? Perhaps a bad analogy, 2 weeks ago, a soldier was killed by friendly fire, and immediately there was an inquiry into it, and it turned out that his commander, okay, had, by accident, fired him. But there was so I'm not saying they actually couldn't practice these lessons, but there is a culture in the army, okay, of trying to learn from mistakes. So first of all, it's acknowledging that we're making mistakes. I've never heard that. Okay, about the ministry acknowledging that we're not doing things right. There's always some other reason why things aren't happening. Apparently, and I say apparently because it may be out there, but nobody I spoke with knew about it, there was no operational work plan. There was the Harari report, which is a vision statement, okay, where we need to be. It doesn't describe how to get there. This was not operationalized, and because it was not operationalized, there were no milestones, final or interim. And because there's no milestones, okay, there's no assessment, of course, because you don't know what to assess. Okay? So that was a surprise for me. Okay, if you talk about no surprises. There were assessments that were developed, but they came much too late. They came as part of what's called Madarom, okay, which is as the project was already winding down at some stage. Okay, and the assessments that were developed over here were those that in the end became the Mitzvah that I mentioned beforehand. Lack of cooperation between the project team and various divisions in the ministry. You know, large organizations always have conflicts of interest and political fights and so on and so on. And that's fine as long as they don't get in the way of getting things really done. And in this case, they did. Speedy implementation. You'll see in the next slide, which deals with budget. Okay, there was lots of money given to the project in the first year. And you know how ministries work, okay? You have money, you have to spend it. If you don't spend it, you're not going to get next year what you asked for. Because you show that you don't need it, so money has to be spent. Okay, they had lots of money in the first year. I think they had too much money in the first year. And because of that, they had to start doing things immediately. Spending money, they didn't have time to really plan things through. Okay? So, the initiatives that I mentioned before, the garden blooming, that, in my opinion, was an outcome of having too much money without knowing exactly what you're going to do with it. That's my personal opinion, though. Okay? I can't justify that one. It was very difficult in getting indicators about the system status. In other words, at that time, people in the ministry had no idea how well students were doing, what their scores were like, how many students were studying here, you know, which schools are improving, which schools are getting. There was no information. And in the last decade, a new organization called Rama, has been founded here that has exactly that job of gathering and providing information to decision makers to help inform their decisions. That was not available then. It made their work a lot harder. And finally, the review of the project was done internally, not by an external reviewer. Okay? So a member of the project team was basically the reviewer. Now, in Israel, everybody knows everybody. So I'm not so sure it makes so much of a difference if it had been a person from the outside. But I still think that review should have some degree of neutrality, be further distance from this. Talk about funding. On the top is the budget. I'm not going to go into the details. It's not important. What you see, though, is that the first year is funded on the same scale, okay, as the second, third, and fourth year, okay? I think that's too much money to begin. It doesn't give people time to really actually get on a plan and to prepare things for the way it needs to be done. Secondly, if you see how much money was needed to continue the project after 5 years over, it's the same scale as was needed to build the project. Okay, I think that is a death statement before you even begin. Okay, if the system cannot go back to its expenses pre-project, okay, it's not going to be maintained. No one is going to give you that much money over time, continuously. I mentioned the minister turnover, and one of the results of that, as I said, was eliminating hours, okay, emphasizing other subjects. Okay, so one minister changes, no, science and technology is not that important, I'm doing something else. And finally, the regional teacher centers, which almost everybody I spoke with, not everybody, but almost everybody I spoke with, spoke about them as one of the gems of the project. Okay, they were erased, they no longer exist, they were all closed, okay, by administrative order. Okay, I have, I think, 3 more slides and I'm finished. No consistent definition, I mentioned this before, of what it means to combine science and technology. The project was led, the committee was led by Professor Harari, who's a physicist. And if I interpret his philosophy correct, okay, physics, okay, is the core knowledge and things grow out of physics. So technology, okay, is a byproduct of physics. You have to understand the physics, okay, in order to understand the technology. So I would ask 2 questions. First of all, do physicists know how to repair their cars? Okay, just because they know the science doesn't mean you know the technology. But on the other hand, does a mechanic have to understand physics in order to repair your car properly? So the relationship between them, I just want to point, is not well defined. Okay? Teachers who are technology teachers were supposed to be retrained to become science teachers. Okay? It's an abysmal failure. The OR system spent, I don't know, a huge amount of money, okay? And it totally failed. Okay? So retraining teachers from one field to another just didn't work. It didn't work also with the science teachers. So what's happened is basically is that the technology has disappeared. Okay? The science teachers were supposed to be retrained to teach technology all. Again, the technology disappeared because they're still teaching science. They tried to introduce new pedagogies that incorporated projects that had science and technology working together. This is a complete mind shift for teachers, not something that's easy at all. So I think that pretty much has disappeared also. And finally, lack of principal support. It's not that the principals were against it, they just didn't understand what was going on. Okay? 2 principals that we spoke with thought the project was all about school computerization. The fact that it was basically about science and technology, you're kidding me. Okay? So they didn't have the support they needed from their administrators. One point from this slide, or else I'll be repeating myself. The few schools that we found that actually have succeeded until today maintaining something of the vision of the project and the way they thought science and technology should be taught are those schools where their core teachers all underwent intensive PD and they haven't changed. They're still teaching today. Okay? And so there's this internal support group. Okay, their colleagues are all with them. They don't have to fight other people, newcomers and so on. They have a critical mass inside the school and they are able to carry things forward. I mentioned the syllabus before, I'm going to skip over that, but basically the result of having a curriculum designed for 6 weekly hours and only giving 2 to 3 hours a week, that it leads to mile-wide and inch-deep instruction. You have to cover everything. You don't have time to cover everything, so you just mention things. Go quickly off the next, so you can put V's. Okay, yes, I did this, I did this, I did this. Curriculum materials, I have no time. I'm going to skip ahead. Final slide. What do I take away from all this? 4 points. The first is that without long-term political support, don't undertake long-term educational reforms. They're not going to work if they change so quickly. You need to have some continuity in the political support behind you. Second, Ministry of Education has to become a learning organization. Everything we're talking about today is going to make no difference unless they change their internal culture of wanting to self-improve. Thirdly, things need to be coordinated to the smallest detail. Like any system is only good as its weakest component. Okay? The one thing that you're not paying attention to is the one thing that's going to force you down. So everything has to be coordinated together, otherwise it's not going to work. And finally, be explicit about what your goals are, what you want to obtain, how you think they should be. Don't leave things vague for people to guess because people will interpret it differently than you meant. That's it. Thank you.